firearms, freedom. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to episode 16 of Armed Lutheran Radio. I am your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran. This episode brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made, custom Kydex holsters with a lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Go to cooksholsters.com, use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST, and get 15% off everything in the store. That's www.cooksholsters.com. On today's show, we've got Sergeant Bill sharing tips for getting started if you're thinking about shooting IDPA. We're going to try to put the best construction on the most bizarre argument against armed self-defense I think I've ever read from a commie blogger at the Huffington Post. And we've got another installment of Clinging to God and Guns with Pastor John Bennett. All that straight ahead on Armed Lutheran Radio.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
With those words, our founding fathers changed the world. They launched an experiment in freedom, where common lawful citizens are free to speak and gather and worship as they choose. But first among those freedoms is the one freedom that makes the rest possible. For 130 years, we've worked to preserve freedom first. I'm Wayne LaPierre of the National Rifle Association.
Pistols, prayer, and potluck. You're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.
In the explanation of the Eighth Commandment from the Small Catechism, Luther says we should fear and love God so that we may not deceitfully betray, slander, or defame our neighbor, but defend him, speak well of him, and put the best construction on everything. Well, I'm having a really hard time putting the best construction on this article from the Huffington Post. It's possible that the author's claimed dyslexia causes him to completely misunderstand everything he reads. Maybe he finished a degree in political science without ever studying the Constitution. Maybe his professors pumped him full of really bad information. That's really the best I can come up with. The Huffington Post is running this series of blog posts by some guy named Justin Curmi. That's C-U-R-M-I. Not Kermie like Miss Piggy's Kermie from The Muppet Show. Anyway, Kermie's series is called A Revision of the Bill of Rights. And given that it's published at the Huffington Post, it's as bad as you might expect. To give you a clue as to who this guy is, and I didn't know, I've never heard of him, according to his Twitter feed, he's a Bernie bot, and apparently he's also the author of a 52-page self-published screed called The Communist, which is available for free on Amazon Kindle, by the way. The book is described as this: what if everything you knew about Marxism was wrong? The Communist is an in-depth look into the Feuerbach by Karl Marx to demonstrate the ideas in it, which then reveals key points of Marxism. Yeah. And to give you an idea of just how good that book is, here's a couple of reviews posted just days ahead of Kermie's latest rant at HuffPo. Said one reviewer, the take a peek inside pages of this book read like this tome was originally written in Urdu, then translated into Mandarin, then into Esperanto, and then finally into English. I found it physically painful to read the first 2 paragraphs. The grammar is unbelievably terrible. I hope Amazon didn't actually pay anything for the publication rights to this train wreck. And here's another one. I fully support people with mental disabilities attempting to become published, but this is unreadable. If it teaches us anything, it's why communism always fails. Well, there's no doubt this guy's writing style for a guy who graduated college is terrible. It is painful to read. Here's an example from his byline, which I'm guessing he wrote himself. His college career was a battle due to personal battles with dyslexia. These battles, are you getting a pattern here? Everything for him was a battle, right? These battles have forced him to learn how to teach himself difficult subject matters without help. Through anguish and painful moments, he has overcome major hurdles that dyslexical presented to him. Okay. Now he is looking towards unorthodox thoughts and methods to analyze political matters. It's no wonder reviewers call this book unreadable. Anyway, so given the fact that the author thinks communism is just swell, if only we'd take a more in-depth look at the ideas behind it, it's no wonder that he examines the U.S. Constitution and gets just about everything completely wrong. So, part 1 of Kermey's series, he tries to break down the preamble of the Bill of Rights for us uneducated lunkheads. And it goes a little something like this. Bear with me. The preamble starts with, quote, "We the people of the United States." There is no description or characteristics to the identity of people that has claims to the USA. The only given information is that it is those who believe in the principles of the USA for the world. Quote, "We" implies an exclusive set of people. Then the following idea is, quote, "the people," which in conjunction with, quote, "we" is stating that people of the USA are people, not alienated people. That was clear as mud, right? Here's a little bit more. The people are what make the USA, and not the monarchy or totalitarian regimes. Thus, quote, "We the people are people who uphold the principles of the USA because the people grant the rights to each other." So, we the people grant rights to each other. And as such, I guess, we could take them away from each other. We're not endowed by our Creator or anything. According to Kermey, there are 5 principles by which all rights and laws should be judged. Does it promote justice? Does it ensure domestic tranquility? Does it ensure the common defense? Does it promote the general welfare? And does it secure the blessings of our liberty and prosperity? And he then proceeds to analyze all of the Bill of Rights in light of those 5 principles. These questions create a check and balance system for the Constitution of the USA. If a potential bill or issue arise that needs to be addressed, it will need to go through these questions. Then it will have to be reviewed through the Bill of Rights. Yep, that was clear. Furthermore, one must understand the Bill of Rights to complete the check and balance system in the Constitution of the USA. These rights give certain powers to an individual and withhold certain powers from the person. Not even close, comrade. The Bill of Rights establishes the limits of government power, not the limits of personal freedom. Might want to try that again. That's the end of the first post. I mean, he doesn't even really make a point. I'm not sure what he's getting at, but in his second post, he takes on the First Amendment, but he really focuses on freedom of religion and your right to address government for redress of grievances, he pretty much ignores the whole free speech bits because, free speech. There's another sterling example of his prose. If there are grievances, the people have the right to peaceably protest and write the government to address the grievance. Thus, the government cannot make a law, but if there is a grievance brought to them by the people, they can ban or bar what is causing the grievance. Like guns, I guess. How this glittering illiterate got published in HuffPo is anyone's guess. Actually, I can guess. He's a commie, so it makes sense. Moving on. So, in his third installment, Kermie takes on the Second Amendment, but he does it in the most tortured way I have ever read. The Second Amendment, says Kermie, is highly contested. There is no doubt that people do have the right to carry and have a stockpile of guns, and a state has the right to organize a well-regulated militia. That was a bit of a surprise, I thought. He accepts that you have a right to carry a gun or to stockpile guns. That's a little surprising coming from somebody of his political worldview. But then he does this. The main issue is on the right of self-defense, the right to self-defend with a firearm. You see, the main problem with the notion of self-defense is that it imposes on justice, for everyone has the right for a fair trial. I don't even know where to go with this. You have a right to carry a gun, you have a right to stockpile guns, but you don't have a right to use them to defend yourself, because doing so, you see, might violate your attacker's Fourth Amendment rights to a fair trial. Yep, you heard me right. That's what he's trying to argue here. He's not going to argue that you don't have a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. You just don't have a right to use them for self-defense. That's an interesting argument. It's one I have honestly never heard before. I've heard people try to suggest that you don't have a right to keep a gun, to own a gun, or to carry a gun out in public, but I've never actually heard somebody say you don't have a right to self-defense because it violates someone else's right to a trial. So, Kermie continues, therefore, using a firearm to defend oneself is not legal. Because if the attacker is killed, he or she is devoid of his or her rights. Well, what about your rights? What about your right to, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all those things that Kermie completely ignores and overlooks? The things that we're endowed by our Creator with. So, according to Kermie, it's not legal to use a firearm to kill someone who's trying to kill you because you would be depriving your killer of his or her right to a fair trial when they are ultimately arrested for your murder. That bit of logic is so twisted, I have no idea how this clown actually managed to graduate from college. I can only guess that this says more about our higher education system in this country than it does about Mr. Kermie. But then Kermie goes on to suggest that your mental capacity, quote unquote, determines your ability to exercise your rights. Now, I don't know whether this only applies to guns or whether it applies to all of your rights, but apparently, in his way of thinking. There can be no tranquility if you don't have the capacity, whatever that means. He writes, in addition, one's mental capacity is a major factor in deciding whether a man or woman has the right to have a firearm. There are two reasons for ensuring mental capacity. First, one of the 5 aims is to ensure domestic tranquility, and there can be no tranquility if one does not have the capacity. That one just blows my mind. Because having read through a good portion of his blog and some of his Twitter feed, and he's posted all of these sort of reviews of the Bill of Rights in a big publication, and I'm concerned about his capacity. I'm not sure he's got the mental capacity to exercise his rights. Any of them. Certainly not his First Amendment rights. He's published this entire screed on Google Docs entitled Finding the Rights of a Bill. But he's breaking it down and publishing each part for Huffington Post, just for giggles, I guess. But he posted a link to the entire document on Twitter in a tweet celebrating, of all things, May Day. And he says in that post, it's just so hard to find a publisher. But there are other ways to get your information out there. Well, given the fact that he has a completely twisted grasp of the Constitution, the fact that he writes with the skill of an 8th grader, maybe less, and that my 15-year-old understands the Constitution better than he does, it's no wonder nobody will publish his stuff. And that's the best construction I can put on it.
If you try to purchase a gun for someone who can't, you can buy yourself 10 years in jail. If a friend or relative asks you to lie to a federally licensed firearms retailer so you can buy a gun for him, don't do it. It's not worth 10 years in jail. Whatever you do, don't lie for the other guy.
This message is brought to you as a public service by the NSSF, the National Shooting Sports Foundation.
Remember, Armed Lutheran Radio comes with a 100% satisfaction guarantee. If you are not completely satisfied, the next episode is free.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. Time now for another Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill Silvia.
This is the Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill. Today's topic, getting started in IDPA. Now, what is IDPA? IDPA is the International Defensive Pistol Association. It's a concealment-based practical shooting sport. If you need to find any information about it, you can go to idpa.com and browse their website. Lots of good information there. Why do people shoot IDPA? Well, it's a lot of fun. You get to learn new skills, practice your skills, shooting skills, gun handling skills. Maybe it's just for the competition. You want to see how well you can do against other people. Maybe you are a concealed carrier and you want to get a little bit of practice and see what it's like to be able to actually draw and move and shoot, which you can't do at most ranges. In IDPA, you can. And a lot of people do it just for the confidence building you get, because you get to try out the things that maybe you practice in dry fire that your square range won't let you do. Ever wondered how fast you can draw and get 2 shots on a target inside of 10 yards? At the square range, the practice range most people go to, you can't do that. You come to IDPA, you'll probably do that on almost every stage you shoot. And then, most importantly, there's the people. I've been shooting IDPA at my local club for about 3 years, and there's several different clubs in my area where I live, and all of the people are fantastic. They're smart, they're knowledgeable, they're friendly as could be, they're fun to be around. It's fantastic. You don't know until you try how awesome it really is. Okay, you're probably asking, what do you need to get started? Well, safety first, right? You need eye protection and ear protection. After that, you're going to need a gun, preferably a 9mm caliber or higher, mostly because 9mm is going to activate the steel. Most people shoot 9mm just because of the cost savings, and there's different classes, but, you know, a 380 is not bad. You can shoot that at some matches, but really, who wants to shoot a 380? It's not the best self-defense round there is. You don't hear of any police departments carrying it, and there's a reason for that. You're going to need 3 good magazines for that gun. You'll need some sort of holster and 2 mag pouches. Now, it could be your concealed carry holster, and you could just get 2 simple mag pouches. Don't go out and spend a whole bunch of money and fret over what's the best thing to get, or what is everybody shooting, what are they carrying. Go to a match, try them out. The biggest thing you're going to find in an IDPA match is what guns work, what gear works, what you like, what you don't like, and you get to just try them out. You'll need anywhere from 100 to 200 rounds of ammo, which sounds like a lot, but it's not that bad. And lastly, you'll need some sort of concealment or cover garment. Now, that could be anything from a jacket to a button-down shirt to a t-shirt over your in the waistband holster or outside the waistband holster, whatever it may be. When you get out to the match, you'll see a lot of people with dedicated competition vests, which aren't bad. You can get just your photographer's vest or fishing vest or tactical vest and use something like that if that's something you like. But just go out, wear a button-down shirt or a sweatshirt or something and try it out like that first, and then you can worry about what gear is going to be best for you. Now, you're going to need to find a club match. Club matches they're in your area. You could probably find them at IDPA.com. There's a tab about the middle of the screen that says Find Matches. You can put in your zip code or your city, and it'll tell you what clubs are around and when they shoot. Now, when you go out to that first match, you want to go early. You're going to go out early because you need to go through a safety briefing so they, pretty much instruct you on what you can and can't do and how to do things safely and where to do them and where not to do them. You also want to get there early so you can help set up. By helping set up, you'll get to meet people and talk to them. You'll get to see how the props are set up and how the targets are and, all the different things that they have set up on the stages and in the bays. It gets you to where you get to know some people that are there. You'll be a little more familiar with what's going on in each stage and how things are constructed. And it'll also give you time to get over a little bit of that nervousness when you first get there. You're excited and you're kind of nervous. It's something new. So that helps out. And you'll be helping out, which will start you out with all the other members thinking, hey, this guy's first time, he's here and he wants to help. Because IDPA is completely member-driven. All the members run the matches. They are safety officers. They build all the props. They set up all the props. They set up all the targets. And that's just how the organization is run, and it's great because of it. Once you get started, what I would recommend is find a mentor. Some clubs actually have a mentor program, some don't, but what you can do is just find somebody on your squad that you're shooting with that maybe it seems like they know what they're doing. Or when you sign in, ask them if there's somebody when you sign in that can show you the ropes and, answer any questions, show you the ins and outs and how to do things and what not to do. And, you'll find that when you do ask questions, and that's what I'm telling you right now to do, is ask lots of questions. Most shooters like to talk about the stages, shooting, matches, their guns, their gear, tips, reloading, anything gun related, even politics, because that's why they're out there, because they love their guns and shooting and freedom. And that's pretty much it. All I can say is get out there and do it. I worked with a guy for several years who used to tell me about shooting IDPA and was bugging me, hey, come out and shoot a match, and I just kept putting it off. And I finally went out on a weekend to go try it out, and they were shooting the Texas State match. And I got to see average Joe shooters all the way up to professional shooters, and I was astounded. I was totally hooked, and all I did was watch. And then the next week when I got to shoot a club match and actually shoot, I was even more hooked. It's so much fun. You can't wait until the next time you go shoot. It's just fantastic. If you already shoot IDPA or USPSA, take a friend. Take them out introduce them to the shooting sports. And if you're not taking a friend, take a family member or just somebody you barely even know. Introduce them to the shooting sports. If they conceal carry or anything, take them out, have them shoot a match, even just come watch a match. They'll be hooked. They'll want to try it. They'll become better shooters. They'll have better skills. They'll have more confidence if they're carrying that gun to protect themselves and their family, or even if they just have a gun at home. That's something that, they're going to build a skill set. They're going to build friendships. They're going to have a blast. I wish I could go back 10 years ago and have started shooting IDPA a long time before I did, because it's a big part of my life now. And I know back then I used to think I was a pretty good shooter, and I look back at how I shot then compared to now, and it's night and day. I'm still better than the average Joe back then, but now I'm way better than the average Joe. So just get out there and do it. This has been your Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill.
So, you have your concealed carry permit or license to carry. Now what? Now you need a good holster. Not one of those cheap neoprene prophylactic holsters you can find in the big box stores. You need a holster custom built for the firearm you intend to carry every day. Check out cooksholsters.com. Made in the USA, Cooks holsters are available in a wide range of colors and designs for inside the waistband or outside the waistband carry. They offer a lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and take 15% off everything in the store. You put in the time and effort to legally carry a firearm for personal protection. Protect your firearm with a custom holster. Choose cooksholsters.com.
Hi, this is Reverend Ken Blanchard, also known as the Black Man with a Gun, and you're listening to my friend and brother from another mother, the Armed Lutheran.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. Time now for another episode of Clinging to God and Guns with the pastor of St. John Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. John Bennett is back with us again. Welcome back, Pastor.
Wonderful to be back.
And today we have an article from an associate reverend. I'm not sure what church he represents, but he's writing at a blog for the Dominican Sisters of Peace, and it's entitled Children Killing Children Must End Now, Part 2. And this is fairly recently. This is from November 2nd of last year. And it starts a little something like this. 3 years ago, I wrote an article for the Dominican Sisters of Peace entitled Children Killing Children Must End Now. It was written days after the shooting in Chardon, Ohio, in a high school cafeteria in which one child killed 3 children and wounded 3 more. He did it with his grandparents' .22 caliber handgun, which he took from their home on a visit. When I was asked a few weeks ago to write again, I said yes. Since then, I have sat down 3 times to write and came up empty. What can I say? What can any of us say? Well, I can think of a few things, but apparently this is what the pastor came up with.
Well, as you have said many times on your show, what gun law or what background check would have prevented this from happening? Because the kid committed a felony in order to commit murder.
Exactly. Yep. So since Daniel Parmerter, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin were killed in a small town, thousands of shootings have taken place, and hundreds of them involved children killing other children. This is where things get a little misleading, or maybe a lot misleading. In a sense, every senseless act of gun violence is one of a child killing a child. It is one child of God murdering another child of God. Each time this happens, God weeps. God weeps as God wept when Cain killed Abel and set the murderous cycle of the human family in motion.
Well, there's a few things going on here that need to be addressed. The first is he very loosely defines what a child of God is. A child of God, by definition, when we look at Scripture, is someone who believes in Jesus Christ as the incarnate Son of God, crucified and risen again for our salvation. Now, there are a lot of very liberal theologians out there who have bought into this idea that no one's going to hell, that everyone is a child of God by default. So I don't quite know what his angle is here, but there are a lot of unbelievers that commit murder too. So right there, it validates his claim that every, what he calls a senseless act of gun violence, involves one child of God killing another child of God. That is statistically, technically impossible. The other side of this too is that he uses this term, every senseless act of gun violence. I wonder if he would also blanketly apply that category to instances of self-defense, because it seems, as we read on later in the article, that just simply owning a firearm puts you into a category of a mental case.
Right.
So, but he does have a good point here, that every time murder happens, God indeed weeps, because God is the author of life. And when sinners take the power into their own hands to end life, a power that rightly belongs to God, which I would also add in Scripture that the power to end life is also given to the state in terms of capital punishment. But yes, indeed, God weeps. I think that's good to point out. But another point too, God, he mentions that when Cain killed Abel, I would like to just point out for the record that Cain used a rock. Right. So
we need rock control.
That's right.
The media and politicians, even religious leaders, focus too often on the mental health of the shooters. I haven't found that to be the case, but while it is true each attacker is suffering a psychic break of some sort, it is still the gun fired from their fingertips that shatters the world of everyone around them. Recently, a young man struggling with mental illness told me on a pastoral visit that he and others in his inpatient unit are troubled that the world sees them as violent simply because they struggle with mental illness. Quote, "We feel as though the world blames us and fears us for these mass shootings. We are here trying to get better. We don't want to hurt anyone. That's all. Mental illness is not the trigger for the gun. The gun has its own trigger."
Wow. I don't know where to start. He basically gives the excuse that mental illness, a quote-unquote psychic break, is what causes every instance of gun violence. So, does he discount the reality of evil in this world? There are evil people who do evil things aside from mental illness being an issue. I won't mention his name because he doesn't deserve to be mentioned, but the mass shooter at Fort Hood was a psychiatrist.
Right.
And he was a Muslim.
Right.
And he boldly proclaimed that he was doing Allah's will of waging jihad. So we have cases where these mass shootings happen where it's not an issue of mental illness. It's because the person is at their core an evil person. Right. And I hate to do this because I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I question his story here, that he's visiting this young man with mental illness, and this young man is saying that he's upset because the world blames people with mental illness for these mass shootings. How often is mental illness used as an excuse for violence?
Not very often. The media is typically focusing on the gun and not on the mental illness or the mental state of the shooters.
Right, but what I'm getting at there is how often do individuals who have some sort of diagnosis use their mental illness as an excuse to do something that they know is wrong?
Oh, never, right.
So,
I'm doing this because I'm mentally ill. No, that's
exactly. We see that people use all sorts of excuses to excuse their violent behavior.
Right.
You look at our society today. When anybody ever does something wrong, it's always someone else's fault, whether it's parents or society or the school or poverty. There's all sorts of excuses that are used.
Right. But it's never something wrong with themselves. It's always someone else. Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And so now it's a cop-out for personal responsibility for your actions. Now, granted, there are people who, because of mental illness, do violent things. Mm-hmm. But it almost seems as if he's making the argument that, as he did before, every single instance of gun violence is because somebody's mentally ill.
Right.
I just don't buy that.
No, not at all. The Reverend continues, as my son Daniel said, quote, how do NRA advocates live with themselves by saying guns don't kill people, people kill people? Daniel continues, it really is the guns, Dad. Don't people see through this rhetoric?
Yeah, just the other day I saw a gun sprout legs and run down the street and kill 10 people. It's when there's a case of intentional vehicular homicide, do they blame the car? Or do they blame the nut job driving the car?
Right.
The other thing I would like to add into this is we see all sorts of murder take place without guns. You look at some places in Africa where people are slaughtered with machetes on almost a daily basis. We saw this in Rwanda. It was just horrific bloodshed. Mm-hmm. Were people arguing that it was not the people but the machetes that were doing the killing?
Right.
Why is it that we only see these arguments when it comes to gun violence, where they demonize not human behavior, but the gun?
Right, exactly. And now we get into comparing gun violence or guns to disease. We are facing an epidemic. If this were Ebola, AIDS, lung cancer, caused by children smoking, or Legionnaire's disease affecting our children and families, we would be doing everything in our power to eradicate the disease. But we seem to worship guns instead of seeing their deadly power and influence over us. It's like they have some sort of Svengali control over everyone, and we're hypnotized. Yeah, I've been hypnotized by my guns.
It's really sad that it's not. Of course, I can't say this is true for everyone, because there might be people out there that are worshiping their guns in a literal sense. But the Second Amendment proponents, those who boldly defend and uphold the Second Amendment and celebrate the Second Amendment through personal ownership, we don't in any sense worship our guns. I wouldn't say worship is the proper word to use, but I'll use it anyway since it's the term that he uses. We worship the freedom that personal ownership represents.
Right.
It's not the gun itself, it's the reality that we live in this great country where we are free to own that firearm. And if we look at the framers who crafted the Second Amendment in the first place, the underlying reason for it was so that the citizenry, in the event that they are under the rule of an authoritarian, oppressive government, has the power then, through personal ownership, to rise up and defend their freedom against that oppressive government.
Right. Right. Currently, there is a ratio of one gun for every American. And as you said before, Pastor, that's a win for us.
Yes, and it's 1.12, so I don't want him to underestimate this. It's 1.12 guns.
That's right, he's cutting us short. Again, if the ratio of any disease was 1-to-1, our facing the crisis of such illness would be the major health initiative for the United States. We would do everything in our power to end such a disease. But that's because guns are not a disease.
Yeah, and this is what I find to be terribly offensive. You know, he ends up trying to use theological arguments to explain why personal ownership shouldn't be permitted. But then he essentially is calling gun owners here disease-afflicted individuals.
Right.
It's not gun ownership that's the problem. It's when evil people or mentally ill individuals who either lawfully or unlawfully acquired a firearm use it in a manner to take life.
Right.
By his blanket statement here, he also is basically saying that those who own firearms for sporting purposes, for self-defense, are also grouped into the same conglomerate of individuals who are mentally ill and use firearms in illegal ways. And it's offensive. It truly is offensive.
They're just part of the disease.
Yeah.
By doing nothing, our nation's hospital emergency rooms will continue to fill with the blood of our children. Nursing homes will fill with young survivors of gun violence. I hate that term. Weeping in funeral homes and churches will continue as if that wasn't happening before gun violence. Again, and I just used the term, it's driving me crazy. Our schools will become more and more militarized. Teachers from kindergarten through college will become armed. The strain on our prison population will rise. And our medical, legal, and insurance costs will continue to skyrocket.
That was caused by Obamacare. It had nothing to do with
I started to say, what did they have to... That had nothing to do with guns. Most significantly, the death toll among our children will rise. By doing nothing, we allow gun violence terror to continue to reign supreme in our land.
Well, as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. First thing to point out is that he uses all these analogies. He mentions teachers from kindergarten through college becoming armed as if that's a bad thing. In fact, I read an article just the last week or two of a school district in California, of all places, that was considering allowing their teachers to go through the proper training to get their concealed weapon permits.
Wow.
And to carry in the classroom. Yeah. It had to have been somewhere in the central part of the state. That area is also known. In California, the way it works, if you want to get a concealed weapons permit, it is up to the discretion of the county sheriff to issue that.
So it shall issue, or may issue, right?
Right, and places in the central part of the state are more known for permitting that area, such as Bakersfield and Fresno, and I believe it was in one of those areas. So when we have issues where we have young people illegally acquiring firearms, I would say it is a good thing if the teachers are properly trained and lawfully armed. What would have happened in Newtown or Columbine or Virginia Tech or any of these places where we've had these horrific shootings on college or school campuses? What would have happened if the teachers were lawfully armed and properly trained?
We certainly wouldn't have had the death toll that we did.
No. I mean, you're still, in instances like that, yeah, there's a good chance there's still going to be some loss of innocent life, but that loss would be greatly mitigated if there's somebody who's properly trained in using a firearm for self-defense that's on the premises. But the point I want to really focus in on here is he says, most significantly, the death toll among our children will rise. By doing nothing, we allow gun violence terror to continue to reign supreme in our land. I started out by saying facts are stubborn things. Statistically, gun violence has been increasingly lowered throughout the years.
Right.
The NRA has had this project where they're going into schools and they're teaching children how to respond when they see a firearm.
Right.
And statistically, since they started that project, accidental gun deaths among children has actually decreased. So facts are not on this gentleman's side.
Right. The accidental firearms deaths among children are at lowest point ever, and this is where he gets. This is the thing that really bothers me about this article is how he goes back and forth using this term children very loosely to talk about both small school children to sort of evoke this emotional response from people, and at the same time mixing in children as in children of God, adults who are,
right.
His other definition of children of God. The gangbanger in the street is also a child of God, and by the definition that he's using. So he's mixing it all together in a way that's very deceptive.
Yeah.
When you really get down and, like you said, when you look at the facts, deaths, accidental deaths, firearms deaths among children are very, very low. And when you look at actual, the children, quote unquote, that gun ban groups like to define, typically they use teenagers who are members of gangs as part of that definition to get their numbers up.
Right. Yeah, when you have some 19-year-old thug
right.
kill a 7-year-old in a drive-by shooting, that isn't one child of God killing another child of God. That is a thug illegally, irresponsibly taking innocent life because of his intent to cause harm to a rival gang. It's just absolutely a ridiculous argument.
Right. And the statement, by doing nothing, we allow gun violence terror to continue. The doing nothing is not taking these people off the streets. We're not
right.
We're not actually taking these thugs off the streets and locking them up and keeping them there. We're taking them off the street, putting them back on the street over and over and over again, and they're committing crime after crime after crime. That's what we're doing to allow this quote-unquote gun violence terror that he refers to continue. It's not the fact that there are guns, it's the fact that there are criminals, and we're not doing anything about them.
Right. And what is the something that he would have us do? Of course, he's arguing for stricter gun control, and, we've talked about this many times, and I'm sure we'll talk about it many times in the future. But you look at the places in our country that have the highest rates of gun violence, and it's those places that have done exactly what this guy wants to happen across the country, where they have very strict gun laws.
Right. Exactly.
It just does not work.
Right. As Christians, we are followers of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. As Dominicans, we are an order of preachers called to preach the gospel with holy fire. God's holy fire in our lives must pray against, stand against, preach against, and march against firearms out of control. Perhaps we should call the movement Holy Fire versus Firearms. Well, that's cute.
Those rascally firearms are always out wreaking havoc.
I know. It's awful. I saw one running down the street the other day.
We're called to follow the Prince of Peace, but this doesn't mean that, I as a pastor, I do not have a mandate to preach from the pulpit about gun violence. No one has a mandate to preach from the pulpit about gun violence. And the truth is, what he's really not preaching about is gun violence. What he's preaching about is a lack of stricter gun control.
Right.
It has it's what came first, the chicken or the egg situation. In his mind, the problem isn't necessarily the fact that there are lawful gun owners out there who use their firearms in responsible ways to defend their life and the life of loved ones every single day. His problem is gun ownership in the first place. And in his mind, in order to mitigate this gun violence where these inanimate objects are just striking down people left and right, you have to mandate stricter gun control. That really is his argument. It's not about curbing gun violence, because if that was his purpose, they'd be spending more time strengthening the families. Most of these cases where you see gun violence, Chicago, places like that, you have these gangs where most of these young men don't have any father figure. The gang becomes their family. Right. So he's taking inactive, he wants ineffective methods for curtailing gun violence, and it just doesn't make sense.
Right. So let us follow Jesus and preach and act with a holy fire against the carrying and firing of guns all around us. When Jesus' disciple Peter struck Malchus with a sword, slicing off his ear in self-defense, Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its sheath." John 18:10-11. Let us join with our Lord and say together, "Sheath your weapons."
Well, as you pointed out in your Easter episode, what Peter was attempting to do was prevent Jesus from following the path that led to Calvary's cross.
Right.
To prevent Jesus from going to the cross and atoning for our sins. This really is a false analogy. It's one that I've seen from Christian gun control advocates in the past. They seem to forget where Jesus instructs his disciples during Holy Week to arm themselves.
Right.
It also, this doesn't negate a person's ability to defend themselves by purchasing a firearm. Jesus nowhere says that you are not permitted to defend your life.
Right.
I've looked through the scripture. I've read through the Bible. You know, my goal every year, I read the Bible at least once every year. And nowhere have I come across any passage where it says, "Thou shalt not defend thyself."
Or "Thou shalt not own a sword."
Right.
Sheath your sword is a lot different from get rid of your swords.
Right. And that's what he's saying, to preach with holy fire against the carrying and firing of guns all around us.
As we do this, let us remember that the only group of people that benefit from guns being purchased and used with few restrictions are those associated with the gun industry. I'm not associated with the gun industry, and I've benefited greatly. Although this past weekend, I'm not sure that's the case. I didn't benefit very much, but I still had a good time. I benefit, all of us benefit. The freedom to own a firearm is a benefit to every American. Whether we take that gun out and shoot it, whether we ever take it out of the safe, that freedom is a benefit to every American. It's not, and this the gun industry is the big evil. It's amazing how many times we see in all these articles that you and I have gone through, these religious people, these pastors, these theologians will go through and try to make a theological argument against gun ownership or in favor of gun control, and yet there's so many standard liberal talking points.
Right. Yeah, in fact, just this last week or so, Hillary Clinton came out stating that she believed that gun manufacturers should be held liable if somebody is killed with one of their guns.
Right.
The thing I want to point out here too is that it seems, well, first of all, to all the gun control advocates out there, get over it. You're not going to be able to get rid of guns. When you live in a country where there are more guns than people, even if you outlawed personal ownership and went through a confiscation program, you still would have hundreds of thousands of firearms, perhaps millions, still out there floating around. So you're not going to get rid of guns. The CDC's statistics on instances annually where a firearm is used in self-defense, it really has a very broad range. And if you read the report, part of the reason for this huge variance is how do you define an instance of self-defense where a firearm is used? Whether is it an instance where somebody is actually having to brandish a firearm, and that's enough to scare off the attacker, or is it when it comes down to actually firing?
Right.
The statistics, a minimum, they say 100,000 cases a year at a minimum. The maximum is 3 million cases a year. So there's that wide of a variance. But even if we take the lowest number, there are at least 100,000 people, and you could expand it even more if you include innocent bystanders, every year who benefit from owning a firearm.
Right. Yep.
Exactly. So his statement is just blanketly false. It's not the gun industry alone that benefits.
Right. To end gun violence, we need to begin immediately. Wherever there are legislators making it easier to buy and sell guns, we must oppose these efforts. We must offer legislation which ends the easy purchase, sale, and use of handguns and, automatic weapons. Where is this guy getting it? Clearly, this Reverend Tim Ahrens has no idea what he's talking about. Automatic weapons?
Yeah, well, I hope he doesn't know what he's talking about, because if he does know what he's talking about, it means he's blanketly lying to his audience.
That would be putting the best construction on what he's...
He says we must offer legislation which ends the easy purchase, sale, and use of handguns and automatic weapons. So he wants to try and eliminate the use. Does that include hunting? Does that include recreation? Does he intend to end the use in cases of self-defense? And has he ever actually tried to go and lawfully purchase a firearm?
I would guess not.
Because granted, if it's through an illegal purchase, yeah, that might be a lot easier if you know the right people, or I guess you say if you know the wrong people. But just as an example, perfect example, I was one day just putching around. I went to a gun shop that's in the Twin Cities area, and as I was standing there looking at guns, there was a young man who was trying to purchase a firearm, and the dealer had called in to do the background check. And after he got off the phone, he responded to the young man that they have declined to approve you for the purchase, that you have to wait a certain number of days. They guarantee they'll be back to you within a certain number of days. Sometimes it's a few hours. Sometimes it could be a week. So there are cases where it's not easy to purchase. You do have to go through the proper channels. You can't have a criminal background to lawfully purchase a firearm.
Right. Exactly. Well, the Reverend goes on, our children and the children of our churches are watching us and hoping and praying that they are safe to enter our churches and our schools and grow in faith, wisdom, and understanding of God and life. Their future peace depends on our efforts now. We all agree that children killing children must end. Let's do our part to see that this happens. By the way, some of my words are exactly the same as those shared 3 years ago. May God's holy fire fill us with new resolve for action. I suspect in 3 years he'll be moaning and saying the same ignorant things. I would suggest that maybe he educate himself a little bit about guns and about actual crime statistics and maybe a little bit about how much quote-unquote gun violence has declined as gun ownership has increased. And maybe he'd have a different perspective, but I doubt it because he's a liberal. So,
right. And I will say I have a lot more respect for the individual who argues these points and at least has their statistics and facts right, instead of ones that just spout endless propaganda talking points from the left.
Right. Well, I think that one's fully debunked. That will do it for this episode of Clinging to God and Guns. Pastor, thank you for joining us again.
Great. That was a pleasure being with you.
And thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for another episode next time on Armed Lutheran Radio. Well, that's going to wrap it up for another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. Thank you for listening. Thanks to Pastor John Bennett for joining us again this week. Thank you to Sergeant Bill Silvia for his contribution to the show. Be sure to join us next week. We've got a special guest as Pastor Brian Wolfmueller from Hope Lutheran Church in Aurora, Colorado, and the co-host of Table Talk Radio will be joining us to talk about the three estates and how they relate to self-defense and the Second Amendment. Thank you all for listening. Keep shooting, keep praying, and we'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @ArmedLutheran and like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/TheArmedLutheran. You can contact us by email at armedlutheranradio@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 855-54-ARMED. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.